Born in 1991, Gypsy Rose Blanchard was raised by her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard. The two of them lived together in their Louisiana home. At only 3 months of age, Dee Dee would tell doctors that Gypsy was having trouble breathing. They soon diagnosed her with sleep apnea and gave her a breathing apparatus. Unfortunately, this wouldn't be the end of Gypsy's health complications. At the age of 7, it would be discovered that she had a chromosomal disorder which confined her to a wheelchair. Along with this, she would be diagnosed with a plethora of other disorders such as epilepsy, muscular dystrophy, asthma, leukemia, lung disease, and heart murmurs. Unfortunately, this meant Gypsy needed a feeding tube and was put on a cocktail of prescription medications, some which literally made her teeth fall out. Between 2005 and 2014, she was taken to the hospital over 100 times. Friends and extended family members feared the worst. Luckily, Gypsy had her mother to take care of her. She would often talk about how grateful she was to have her mother. The two were inseparable. Later on, Dee Dee would take Gypsy to a Miranda Lambert's concert and even take a photo op with a celebrity. Miranda, learning of the struggles the two went through, would send a check for $6,000. This was a huge deal considering their financial issues. The generosity of strangers is how the two normally got by. As time went on, Gypsy's health would only grow worse and worse. By the time she was a teenager, she would escape her hellish reality by watching Disney movies on repeat. Then, when she was 22, she created a profile on a Christian dating site. There, she would match with a man named Nick Godejohn who didn't mind her health conditions or the fact that she was bound to a wheelchair. And with this, the two would begin to date online. Gypsy would hide this relationship from her mother, even going so far as to create a second Facebook page. Gypsy and Nick would plan to meet in public. However, she had a dark secret she needed to reveal to him. The secret was that she could walk just fine. Her mother was forcing her to be in the wheelchair. Not only this, but she had no medical problems at all. Her head was even shaved to keep up the facade that she had leukemia. Gypsy had suffered decades of psychological abuse by the hands of Dee Dee. Until she was 19, Gypsy didn't even know how old she was until she found her birth certificate in her mother's safe. Before that, she believed that she was only 15 years old. Following this incident, she would run away, but would soon be caught by her mother. Gypsy would then be handcuffed to her bed for 2 weeks. Possibly worst of all, Dee Dee would manipulate doctors into performing dozens of unnecessary surgeries on her daughter. Some of the painful surgeries included stripping muscles from her thigh to prove she had muscular dystrophy. Furthermore, she would threaten Gypsy, telling her that if she ever told anyone the truth, she would smash her fingers with a hammer. Despite this, Gypsy would walk without her mother knowing at times. Her mother would catch her on occasion. This led to Gypsy being beaten with coat hangers and Dee Dee verbally abusing her. Friends and family would later describe Dee Dee as being evil, some even suspecting her of murdering her own mother by starving her to death. Gypsy's hellish reality was her mother's abuse, not her non-existent medical conditions. After revealing all of this information to Nick, the two would make plans to meet at a local movie theater. With Dee Dee tagging along, Gypsy would go to the movie, meet Nick, and then pretend that it was their first time meeting. The two would soon sneak away and then have intercourse in a bathroom. Eventually, the movie would end and Dee Dee would forbid Gypsy from seeing Nick. 2 days later, the two would get into an argument over Gypsy's feeding tube, her protesting that she no longer wanted to wear it. Following this argument, Gypsy and Nick would make plans to murder the 48-year-old woman. Nick agreed to the killing but stated that he wanted to rape Dee Dee beforehand, which Gypsy refused. After this, Nick would get on a Greyhound bus and leave Wisconsin. Once he arrived to Springfield, Missouri, he would stay at a local hotel until he received a text from Gypsy stating that her mother was asleep. The two had just finished spending time painting each other's nails, having made up over their recent argument over the feeding tube. The last thing Dee Dee had said before going to bed was, "Don't hurt me." On that same night of June 19th, 2015, Nick would arrive to the Blanchard house. There he would find a pair of rubber gloves that Gypsy had left by the front door. After slipping them on, he'd enter the house, taking care to heed Gypsy's warning of the squeaky screen door. Wearing a hoodie and dark clothing, he'd walk carefully through the house. At this time, Gypsy would hand him a knife. Nick would respond, "Get your ass in the bathroom now." She would do as told, going to the restroom, curling up in the fetal position and placing her hands over her ears. Unfortunately, her hands couldn't muffle the sounds of her screaming mother. During this time, Nick had entered Dee Dee's bedroom, who was sleeping on her stomach. And with this, he would creep toward her, then plunge the knife into her back. She would let out a blood-curdling scream. Ignoring this, he'd continue violently stabbing her as she cried out for Gypsy. Blood splattered in his face. For around 5 minutes, he would continuously drive the blade into her back. Later during interrogation, he would admit that he knew the knife went into her lung because it was very hard to pull out. After the murder, the two would have intercourse, clean up the fingerprints, and then pack up their stuff. They would take the knife as well as $4,000 in cash from Dee Dee and then mail it to Nick's parents' house. From this point, they would head to a motel and stay the night. The next morning, they would take a Greyhound bus to Wisconsin and then stay with Nick's mother and stepfather. On Dee Dee and Gypsy's shared Facebook page, Gypsy would post messages stating that her mother was dead, even going so far as to detail the crime. Her plan was to trick police into thinking that someone else had killed her mother. Unfortunately for her, it would have the opposite effect. Concerned neighbors would contact police, who would then discover Dee Dee's dead body. From here, they would trace the Facebook message back to Nick's home and would arrest the two of them. Both would confess to the murder. Nick would be sentenced to life in prison while Gypsy would be given 10 years. Was the murder justified? Dee Dee's own family would state that they weren't surprised at the murder. Others would go on to say that she got what she deserved. Not a single one of them wanted her ashes after she was cremated. In fact, her sister would joke about flushing them down the toilet. Was Gypsy an innocent victim who had no other option to escape her mother's abuse? On the other hand, Nick has a criminal record, once being caught masturbating in a McDonald's for 9 hours. Along with this, he had dark fantasies of violence. However, with Dee Dee being a master manipulator, it is highly likely that Gypsy inherited her mother's behavior patterns. Children tend to take on the traits that they are raised around. During an interview, she would later admit that her mother taught her to be a very good liar with no conscience. With this, it is entirely possible that Nick was manipulated by Gypsy. In his police interrogation, he stated that he would never have killed Dee Dee if Gypsy didn't ask him to. Who exactly is to blame in this case? Dee Dee, who abused her daughter for over 20 years, Gypsy, who asked her boyfriend to kill her mother, or Nick, who committed the actual murder? This case in particular is very complex and has been called one of the worst cases of Munchausen by proxy ever discovered. Did Gypsy need to do this to escape the abuse? Did she manipulate Nick? Leave your opinions down below.